In the year 1532, the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere stretched from the ice fields of present-day Chile to the sweltering jungles of Colombia. It covered more than 4 million square kilometers. It held somewhere between 10 and 12 million people under one rule, one language, one sun. Its roads were better engineered than anything in Europe at the time. Its food storage system could feed an entire nation through years of drought. The Sapa Inca, the son of the sun, was not merely a king. He was a living god. And within 18 months, every single piece of it was gone. Picture the city of Cusco at its height. Stone temples sheathed in sheets of hammered gold that caught the morning light and threw it back across the mountains like a second sunrise. Priests who tracked the movements of celestial bodies with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for another century. Farmers who carved the Andean slopes into terraced gardens so precise, so perfectly engineered that they are still used today. An empire that had never known the wheel, never developed a written alphabet in the conventional sense, and yet built aqueducts, suspension bridges, and a communication network that could relay a message across 3,000 kilometers in less than a week. This was not a primitive civilization stumbling through history. This was a machine of staggering sophistication, running at full power. And then 168 men arrived on the coast. 168. Starving, sun-scorched, half of them sick, led by a man who could not read his own name. They had no reinforcements within 1,000 miles. They had no maps. They had no real plan beyond a desperate, almost suicidal gamble that had already failed twice before. What they had was horses, steel, and a piece of timing so catastrophic for the Inca that it almost defies belief. Because the empire that greeted them was not the empire at its peak. It was an empire that had just finished tearing itself apart from the inside. The civil war between the brothers Huáscar and Atahualpa had left hundreds of thousands dead. The roads were still soaked with the blood of armies that had fought not against a foreign enemy, but against each other, for the right to call themselves the son of the sun. The winner, Atahualpa, sat at Cajamarca with 80,000 soldiers at his back, freshly victorious, untouchable. He had heard of the strangers moving through his land. He was not afraid. He had every reason not to be afraid. And that confidence, that absolute divine certainty that he was the most powerful man on earth, was the last mistake he would ever make. What happened next is one of the most violent, most improbable, and most consequential collisions in human history. It is a story about military genius and catastrophic miscalculation. About gold and betrayal, and a god who learned too late that gods can bleed. It is a story about how empires fall, not always because they are weak, but sometimes because they are blindsided by something so far outside their understanding of the world that they have no framework to even recognize the threat. The Inca had a word for the world they knew, Tawantinsuyu. The 4 quarters of the earth united under the sun. They had no word for what was coming. No word for the end of everything. There is a road that runs the length of the Andes, 40,000 kilometers of stone, cut and laid by hand, climbing mountains that would defeat modern construction equipment, threading through valleys so deep they swallow the sky. No wheel ever rolled on it. No horse ever walked it before 1532. And yet it worked. It moved armies, messages, food, and the will of a single man across a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its peak, with a precision that most modern bureaucracies still cannot match. That road was called the Capacnan, the Royal Road, and it was just one piece of the machine known as Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire, the most sophisticated civilization the Western Hemisphere had ever produced. At its height, it stretched from what is now southern Colombia down to the Atacama Desert in Chile, from the Pacific coast to the edge of the Amazon jungle. 4 million square kilometers, somewhere between 10 and 12 million people, all of them fed, all of them organized, all of them bound by the same language, the same laws, and the same absolute certainty that their emperor was the literal son of the sun god himself. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a representative of a god, not a priest who spoke on behalf of a god, the actual sun, the living embodiment of Inti, the sun, walking the earth in human form. The Sapa Inca, a title that means the unique one, did not merely rule. He was the axis around which the world turned. When he traveled, he was carried on a golden litter by specially trained bearers who were never allowed to set him down. His feet were not supposed to touch the ground. Even the earth itself was too ordinary a thing for him. And this was not just mythology. It was the operating system of an entire civilization. The Sapa Inca owned everything: the land, the livestock, the labor of every person within the empire's borders, the very air over the mountains. In exchange, the state fed you when the harvest failed, built your house when disaster struck, and stored enough surplus food in a network of thousands of warehouses called kolkas that even after years of drought, no one starved. It was the most elaborate system of collective organization the ancient world had ever constructed, and it ran not on money, because the Inca had no currency, but on labor. You paid your taxes in work, and the state, in return, took care of everything. Here is what that looked like on the ground. In the highlands of Peru, you might have been a farmer growing potatoes and quinoa on terraced fields carved into the Andean slope with a geometric precision that still astonishes modern engineers. Your terrace did not erode. It retained water through systems of underground channels that fed moisture directly to the roots. The same terrace design produced harvests at altitudes where no European agricultural technique could have coaxed a single crop from the soil. You had never seen a plow. You had never needed one. The Inca had developed something far better. In the cities, the architecture was something else entirely. Cusco, the capital, was laid out in the shape of a puma, the sacred animal of Andean cosmology. At its heart stood the Coricancha, the temple of the sun, whose outer walls were sheathed in 700 sheets of solid gold, each one weighing roughly 2 kilograms. Inside, a golden disc the size of a cartwheel reflected the morning light so intensely it could be seen from the hills above the city. The Spanish, who eventually melted it all down, described it in their letters home with a desperate inadequacy, as if the words in their language simply could not hold what their eyes had seen. Now here is the first thing that should stop you cold. The Inca built all of this. Roads, temples, aqueducts, suspension bridges, a continent-spanning administrative apparatus, without a single written word. No alphabet, no script, no written records as we understand them. They used a system called quipu, knotted strings of different colors and configurations that encoded census data, tribute records, possibly even narrative histories, but nothing a European in 1532 would have recognized as writing. And yet, the empire functioned with staggering efficiency, absorbed dozens of distinct civilizations, each with their own language and customs, and integrated them without erasing what made them unique. That is not the behavior of a primitive culture. That is sophisticated statecraft. But here is the second thing, the thing that matters for everything that comes after. The Inca Empire was young, terrifyingly young, for something so vast. Tawantinsuyu, as a true continental superpower, was essentially the project of 3 or 4 generations. The explosive expansion happened under a ruler called Pachacuti. The name means, he who transforms the earth, who in the mid-1400s took a small regional kingdom in the Cusco Valley and began absorbing everything around it with a combination of military force and political brilliance that has no equal in South American history. His son continued the expansion. His grandson pushed it further. And then the machine that had been running at full speed for barely a century slammed into something it had never encountered before, itself. The question of succession in the Inca world was not simple. It was, in fact, a wound built into the system from the very beginning. The Sapa Inca did not automatically pass the throne to his firstborn. He chose his heir from among his sons by his principal wife, his Koya, who was typically his own sister, because only a woman of equally divine blood was considered a worthy mother for the next son of the sun. But the Sapa Inca also had many other wives, dozens, sometimes hundreds, and those women bore sons who believed they too had a claim, sons who commanded armies, who had built loyalties among the generals who had fought alongside them. Succession was not an orderly handoff. It was a controlled explosion, and it needed only one moment of instability to go off. Sometime around 1527, that moment arrived. The reigning Sapa Inca died, possibly from a disease that had reached the continent ahead of the Europeans themselves, spreading invisibly through trade networks before any Spanish boot had touched the highlands. He died without clearly designating his successor. 2 of his sons emerged with competing claims: Huáscar, who held Cusco and the weight of tradition behind him, and Atahualpa, who commanded the loyalty of the most battle-hardened army in the empire, stationed in the northern stronghold near Quito. What followed was not a political dispute. It was a civil war of staggering brutality that lasted 5 years and left hundreds of thousands dead. Soldiers, nobles, administrators, entire family lines erased because they had stood on the wrong side. By the time the strangers appeared on the coast, Atahualpa had won. He had crushed Huáscar's forces in battle after brutal battle, captured his own half-brother, and was sitting at Cajamarca with 80,000 soldiers around him, celebrating a victory that felt absolute. The empire was his. The roads still ran, the cloacas were still full, the golden disc still blazed in the Coricancha. Everything looked intact from the outside. But the internal scaffolding, the network of alliances, the loyalty of conquered peoples, the administrative class that kept the whole thing breathing, had been shredded by 5 years of fratricidal war. Whole regions that had chafed under Inca rule for decades were quietly calculating whether this was finally their moment. The machine was still moving, but it had never been more fragile. And somewhere on the Pacific coast, 168 men were walking toward it with a plan so audacious it bordered on insanity. And a secret weapon that Atahualpa, for all his brilliance, had no framework to even begin to understand. Every empire in history has carried inside it the seed of its own destruction. Rome had its succession crisis baked into the DNA of the Principate from the very first emperor. The Mongol Empire began fragmenting the moment Genghis Khan died because no system existed to hold it together without him. And Tawantinsuyu, the most sophisticated civilization in the Western Hemisphere, had a flaw so fundamental, so structural, so deeply wired into the ideology that made it great, that it was only a matter of time before it detonated. The flaw was this: the Inca had never figured out how to transfer power peacefully. To understand why, you have to understand what the Sapa Inca actually was, not symbolically, but legally within the system. He was not just a ruler. He was the state. His body was sacred. His blood was divine. His decisions were not policy. They were cosmological events. And when he died, something extraordinary happened. He did not fully die. His body was mummified, kept in the Coricancha alongside the mummies of every Sapa Inca before him, still consulted on matters of state, still served food and drink by a dedicated retinue of priests and attendants. The dead king still owned his palace. He still owned his lands. He still owned the loyalty of the noble lineage he had founded. Everything he had accumulated in life remained his in death, administered by his descendants in perpetuity. Now think about what that meant for the next Sapa Inca. He inherited the title. He inherited the divine authority. He inherited the army and the roads and the empire. But he did not inherit the wealth. That belonged to the dead. So every new emperor had to build his own fortune from scratch, which meant every new emperor had a powerful structural incentive to conquer new territories, because conquest was the only mechanism by which a living ruler could accumulate the resources needed to sustain the court, reward loyal generals, and demonstrate that the sun still favored him. The empire had to keep expanding simply to keep functioning. It was not ambition that drove Inca expansion. It was accounting. For a century, this system worked because there was always somewhere new to conquer. But by the early 1500s, the edges of the empire had started to hit natural limits. The Amazon jungle to the east, the Pacific to the west, the Atacama Desert to the south. The machine was beginning to run out of fuel. And into this tension stepped the question of succession, a question that the Inca had never solved cleanly, not once in the history of the empire, and that by 1527 was about to explode with more force than anything the system had ever faced. The reigning Sapa Inca, Huayna Capac, arguably the greatest conqueror in the dynasty's history, died suddenly in the north near Quito while on campaign. The disease that killed him had come from the coast, smallpox, moving invisibly through trade networks years ahead of any Spanish soldier. He died before he could formally designate his successor. Some accounts suggest he intended to split the empire between two sons, Huáscar, based in Cusco and backed by the traditional noble lineages of the capital, and Atahualpa, who had grown up in the north with his father and had earned the fierce loyalty of the empire's most experienced military commanders. Whether this was truly his wish or a story invented after the fact to justify what came next is a question that nobody can answer with certainty. What is certain is what happened. War. Huáscar was crowned first, in Cusco, by the priests and nobles who controlled the traditional levers of power. He was legitimate in the way that mattered most to the people who counted votes in the Inca world. He had the right bloodline, the right location, the right ceremonies performed over him. But he was also, by most accounts, erratic, paranoid, cruel in ways that went beyond the calculated ruthlessness that Inca rulers had always employed. He began executing nobles he suspected of disloyalty, confiscating the estates of dead kings, which was an almost sacrilegious act within the system, and alienating the very people whose support he needed most. He was the legitimate ruler who was actively dismantling his own legitimacy in real time. Atahualpa, in the north, watched and waited. He had something Huáscar did not: the army. Specifically, the generals Quizquiz and Chalcuchima, two commanders who had spent decades fighting alongside Huayna Capac and who were, by any honest military assessment, among the most capable field commanders the empire had ever produced. When the conflict finally broke open into open warfare around 1531, the result was not the quick resolution that Huáscar's backers had expected. It was a 5-year campaign of extraordinary brutality that burned across the length of the empire from north to south, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, massacring entire noble lineages, destroying the administrative infrastructure that kept millions of people fed and organized. The battles were catastrophic. Atahualpa's forces won almost every engagement of significance, because professional military experience beats institutional legitimacy on a battlefield every time. Huáscar's armies were larger in theory, but disorganized in practice, led by commanders whose loyalty was conditional and whose strategic thinking could not match the cold efficiency of Quizquiz and Chalcuchima. By 1532, Huáscar had been captured in battle near Cusco, brought before his half-brother in chains, the son of the sun, humiliated, imprisoned, watching his own family and court being systematically executed around him. Atahualpa had won. The war was over. The new son of the sun sat at Cajamarca, surrounded by 80,000 soldiers, and the empire was his. But here is what the victory had actually cost. The noble class of Cusco, the people who ran the administrative machine, who understood the Quipu records, who maintained the relationships with conquered peoples across 4 million square kilometers, had been decimated. Regions that had submitted to Inca rule decades earlier and had quietly harbored resentment ever since were now watching the empire's internal bleeding with the focused attention of people calculating opportunity. The Huanca people, the Chanca, dozens of smaller groups who had been absorbed into Tawantinsuyu by force and kept inside it by the threat of overwhelming Inca military power, power that had just spent 5 years tearing itself apart. The empire still looked whole from the outside. The roads still ran, the kolkas were still stocked, the golden disk still blazed. But the social contract that held 10 million people together had fractures running through it like cracks in a dam after an earthquake. It had not yet broken, but it would not take much. And there is one more detail, a detail that changes everything about what comes next. Atahualpa, at Cajamarca, knew about the strangers. He had received reports for months about a group of foreign men moving up the coastal road, small in number, strange in appearance, riding animals no one in the empire had a name for. He had the power to destroy them at any moment. He chose not to, because they did not register as a threat. In the entire history of Tawantinsuyu, no outside force had ever challenged the empire from beyond its known borders. The concept of an existential external threat simply did not exist in the Inca understanding of the world. Atahualpa looked at 168 ragged foreigners and saw curiosities, not conquerors. It was the most expensive miscalculation in the history of the Americas. And it was not stupidity that caused it. It was the very completeness of the world he had grown up in, a world so total, so self-sufficient, so absolute in its own logic that it had left no room for imagining what it could not yet see. Let me tell you about Francisco Pizarro, not the statue version, not the bronze hero on horseback that stands in the plaza of his hometown in Extremadura, the real one. The one who was born illegitimate in a region of Spain so poor and so remote that men left it the way people leave a burning building, fast, with nothing, and with no plan to return. He was never taught to read. There is no record that he ever learned. He grew up herding pigs in a place where the most ambitious future a young man could imagine was dying in someone else's war for someone else's king. That is where this story begins. Extremadura in the late 1400s was the kind of place that produced desperate men. Not evil men, necessarily, just men with nothing to lose and a very specific understanding of what the world owed them, which was nothing, and what they were therefore willing to do to take what they wanted, which was everything. It was from this same scorched, forgotten corner of Spain that Hernán Cortés had come, the man who had already done the impossible once, who had walked into the Aztec Empire with a few hundred soldiers and walked out having dismantled it. Pizarro had heard that story. Everyone in the Spanish colonies had heard that story. And Pizarro, pushing 50, with nothing but a reputation for physical endurance and a stubbornness that bordered on pathological, had decided that he was going to do it again. He had already tried twice. The first expedition down the Pacific coast of South America turned back after weeks of starvation, disease, and coastline that refused to offer anything worth conquering. The second reached further, made contact with the edges of what was clearly an enormous and wealthy civilization, and then also collapsed under the weight of its own misery. At the point where his men were stranded on an island called Gallo, starving, sick, and mutinous, the governor of Panama sent a ship to rescue them and ordered the expedition dissolved. Pizarro drew a line in the sand, literally according to the accounts, and said that everyone who crossed to the south toward Peru would find glory and gold, and everyone who crossed north would find only shame. 13 men crossed south with him. 13. The rest went home. That moment, on a miserable equatorial island in the Pacific, is the hinge on which the history of a continent turned. The third expedition was different, because Pizarro had done something shrewd. He had gone to Spain. He had secured an audience with the court of Carlos V, the most powerful monarch in the world, and he had made his pitch in person, with samples of Inca gold and textiles laid out on a table, physical proof that what he was describing was real. The crown granted him the title of Governor and Captain General of Peru, a territory that had not yet been conquered and that he had barely seen. He returned to Panama with a royal license to do what he had spent a decade attempting. He was 60 years old, by most estimates. He could not read the contract he had signed, and he was about to lead 168 men into the heart of an empire of 12 million people. Now stop and look at those numbers honestly. 168 against 12 million. If you ran that calculation through any military model in history, the outcome is a foregone conclusion. The 168 die, probably within hours of meaningful contact. And yet, that is not what happened. So the question is not whether the Spanish won. We know they won. The question that actually matters is, how is it even possible? And the answer is not one thing. It is 5 things colliding at the same moment, each one of which alone would have been survivable for the Inca, but together created a catastrophe that no civilization on Earth could have been prepared for. The first was disease. Smallpox and possibly other European pathogens had been moving through the Americas since the first Spanish settlements in the Caribbean in the 1490s. They traveled faster than any army, faster than any ship, spreading invisibly through trade networks across the continent. By the time Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast in 1532, smallpox had almost certainly already killed millions of people across South America, including, as we have seen, quite possibly the Sapa Inca himself. The population that faced the Spanish had already been devastated by something it had no immunity to and no understanding of. The empire was fighting an invisible war before the visible one had even begun. The second was steel, not just as a material, but as a technology gap that spanned millennia of metallurgical development in a single encounter. Inca weapons were made for Inca warfare, beautifully crafted clubs, slings, bronze-tipped spears, weapons perfectly calibrated for fighting other Andean armies in the high altitudes of the Andes. Against cotton armor and bronze, a Spanish steel sword was essentially invincible. A Spanish steel breastplate, under the conditions of close-quarters combat at Cajamarca, was essentially impenetrable to anything the Inca soldiers carried. The gap was not a difference in courage or skill, it was a difference in raw physics. The third was horses. The Americas had no large domesticated animals of military utility. The llama could carry cargo, the alpaca gave wool. Neither could be ridden, neither could be trained for combat, and neither prepared any human being in the Western Hemisphere for the psychological reality of facing an animal the size of a horse moving at full gallop directly at them. The first time most Inca soldiers saw a horse, they had no framework for processing what they were seeing. It was not an animal from their world. It was something closer to a nightmare made physical. The fourth was firearms. Not because Spanish guns in 1532 were particularly effective weapons by later standards. They were slow to reload, inaccurate beyond short distances, and prone to misfiring in damp conditions. But the sound, the smoke, the flash. In a world where no one had ever heard a gunshot, the psychological effect of a harquebus firing in an enclosed space was something no training could have prepared you for. It was not the bullet that mattered most at Cajamarca. It was the noise, and what the noise did to 8,000 men who had never heard anything like it in their lives. And the fifth, the one that made everything else possible, was timing. Pizarro arrived at the exact moment when the empire was at its most fractured, its most exhausted, its most internally divided. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa had shredded the alliances that held the system together. There were entire peoples within the empire's borders who hated the Inca with a specific, carefully tended grievance. Conquered nations who had been waiting for exactly this kind of disruption, who would look at Pizarro's arrival not as invasion but as opportunity. Without those alliances, without tens of thousands of local warriors who joined the Spanish cause not out of admiration for Spain, but out of hatred for Cusco, the conquest does not happen. 168 Europeans do not topple a continent. But 168 Europeans plus the accumulated resentments of 100 subjugated peoples? That is a different equation entirely. And Pizarro, illiterate pig farmer from Extremadura, understood this instinctively, even if he could not have articulated it in those terms. He did not need to understand the theory. He just needed to find the cracks. And in the Inca Empire of 1532, the cracks were everywhere. November 16th, 1532. Write that date down somewhere. Not because it is a date you will be tested on, but because it is the date that ended a civilization that had taken 300 years to build. Everything that happened before this day was prologue. Everything that happened after was consequence. And the day itself, the actual hours, the sequence of decisions and hesitations and terrible miscalculations that unfolded in a plaza in the Peruvian highlands, lasted less than one afternoon. That is all it took. One afternoon to break the spine of the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere. Cajamarca was a city of some importance in the northern highlands, not the capital, not the sacred center, but a place of thermal baths and administrative significance where Atahualpa had camped with his army after the final defeat of Huáscar's forces. He had chosen it deliberately as a place to rest, to celebrate, to consolidate his victory before the ceremonial march south to Cusco for his formal coronation as Sapa Inca. His army numbered somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 soldiers, depending on which account you read. Even the lowest estimate dwarfs anything Pizarro could field. The Inca camp spread across the hills above Cajamarca like a second city, the cook fires at night described by Spanish scouts as looking like a sky full of stars dropped to earth. Atahualpa knew exactly how many men he had. He knew exactly how few men Pizarro had. And he was not afraid. Pizarro had sent an emissary ahead, his brother Hernando, and a horseman named Hernando de Soto, who rode his horse directly toward a group of Inca soldiers at full gallop and pulled up short at the last possible moment, a display of horsemanship designed purely to intimidate. Some of the soldiers flinched. Atahualpa reportedly ordered those men executed afterward for showing fear before the strangers. That detail alone tells you everything about who this man was. A ruler so utterly certain of his own power that he punished his own soldiers for having a normal human reaction to something they had never seen before. He agreed to meet Pizarro in the plaza of Cajamarca the following day. He would come, he said, with his retinue. His army would wait in the fields outside the city. He was not walking into a trap. In the entire architecture of his understanding of the world, there was no trap that 168 men could possibly set for a god. Pizarro spent the night deploying his forces inside the buildings that ringed the plaza. The cavalry, hidden in 3 groups, ready to charge on signal. The infantry, positioned at the entrances to the square. The few artillery pieces, 2 small cannons, aimed at the open space in the center. One priest, a man named Vicente de Valverde, assigned to perform the legal and theological formality that the Spanish crown required before any act of conquest. The requerimiento, a document that informed the people being conquered that the Pope had given their lands to the King of Spain and that resistance would be treated as rebellion against God's authority. It had been read aloud to forests, to empty beaches, to people who spoke no Spanish and could not have understood a word of it. It was a piece of bureaucratic theater that existed to make the lawyers in Madrid comfortable. But it was required. And on the morning of November 16th, Pizarro waited behind stone walls with 168 terrified men and rehearsed the gamble one more time in his head. Atahualpa arrived in the late afternoon. He came carried on his golden litter, surrounded by thousands of attendants and soldiers. Accounts vary, but the retinue that entered the plaza itself numbered in the thousands, many of them unarmed or carrying only ceremonial weapons as a gesture of peaceful intent. The plaza was large, but it filled quickly. Atahualpa looked around at the empty square, at the silent buildings, at the absence of the Spanish soldiers he had expected to see, and something shifted in his expression. He asked where the strangers were. And then Valverde walked out alone, holding a Bible and a cross, and began to speak. What happened next has been debated by historians for 5 centuries. The Spanish accounts say that Valverde explained the requerimiento, that Atahualpa took the Bible, examined it, heard no voice from it, and threw it to the ground. An act of sacrilege that gave Pizarro the legal and theological justification to attack. The Inca accounts, filtered through later indigenous chroniclers, describe something more confused. A confrontation between 2 men who could not understand each other, mediated by an interpreter who may not have had the vocabulary in either language to convey what was actually being said. 2 cosmologies colliding in real time with no common ground between them. What is not disputed is what came next. The Bible hit the ground, Pizarro gave the signal, and the world ended. The cannons fired first. Then the cavalry burst from 3 directions simultaneously into a plaza packed so tightly with people that the horses could barely move. The harquebuses fired, their noise alone causing a panic that the Inca soldiers, the ones outside the plaza, the 80,000 who could have intervened, could not immediately process or respond to. The Spanish infantry moved into the crowd with steel swords against men in cotton armor carrying ceremonial weapons. The slaughter was, by every account, absolute. The Inca attendants closest to Atahualpa's litter tried to hold it upright as the Spanish cavalry cut them down. They put their hands under the litter's poles as the men beside them were killed, replacing the fallen with their own bodies, refusing to let the sun of the sun touch the ground even as they died. Some of the litter bearers had their arms cut off at the shoulder and kept the litter elevated on their stumps. That is not mythology. Multiple Spanish accounts confirm it. Whatever you think about what happened at Cajamarca, that detail demands that you pause. Pizarro himself fought through the crowd to reach the litter. He grabbed Atahualpa. He was reportedly cut on the hand by one of his own men in the confusion, the only Spanish casualty of the entire engagement. Atahualpa was pulled from his litter and taken prisoner, and outside the city walls, 80,000 Inca soldiers stood in the fields and did nothing. They did nothing because their entire command structure, their entire cosmological framework, their entire understanding of what was possible had just shattered in the span of 20 minutes. The son of the sun did not get captured. It was not a thing that could happen. And yet, it had happened, right in front of them, and their minds could not bridge the gap between the world as it was supposed to be and the world as it suddenly, horrifyingly, was. By nightfall, somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 Inca attendants were dead. The accounts differ, but all of them agree the number was staggering. Not a single Spanish soldier had been killed. Atahualpa sat in a Spanish-controlled room in Cajamarca, a prisoner, still a god in his own mind, already calculating how to reverse what had just happened. He was not broken. He was not despairing. He was thinking. And the thought he arrived at, the offer he would make to Pizarro in the days that followed, was so extraordinary, so unprecedented, that even Pizarro, a man who had never been surprised by human greed, did not fully believe it at first. But that is the next part of the story. What matters right now, in this moment, in the silence after the screaming stopped over Cajamarca, is this. The most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere was sitting in a room with his hands tied. And the world that had produced him, the roads, the golden temples, the knotted strings that held the memory of a civilization, had just lost the only thing it could not replace. Atahualpa was not a man who had ever been taught to panic. He had been raised from birth inside a system that told him every single day, in every gesture and ceremony and act of deference from every human being around him, that he was beyond the reach of ordinary misfortune. Gods do not panic. Gods assess. And in the days after Cajamarca, sitting in a room guarded by Spanish soldiers who could not speak his language, Atahualpa assessed his situation with the cold precision of a man who had just fought and won a 5-year civil war, and understood, better than almost anyone alive, how power actually worked. He watched his captors. He watched what made their eyes light up. And within a week, he had figured out exactly what they wanted. The offer he made was this. He would fill the room in which he was being held, a room approximately 6 meters wide by 9 meters long, with gold, up to a line he drew on the wall with his hand, as high as he could reach. And he would fill 2 smaller adjoining rooms twice over with silver, all of it delivered within 2 months. In exchange, he wanted his freedom. Pizarro, by every account, stood in silence for a long moment when this was translated to him. Then he agreed, and someone drew a red line on the wall of the room at Cajamarca to mark the height that the gold had to reach, and runners went out across the length of the empire carrying the Sapa Inca's orders, and the greatest ransom in human history began to move. Think about the logistics of what Atahualpa had just set in motion. The Coricancha in Cusco, the Temple of the Sun, the holiest site in the entire Inca world, had its walls stripped of their golden sheets. Ceremonial objects accumulated over centuries of religious practice were pulled from temples across the empire and loaded onto the backs of llama trains and human porters and sent north to Cajamarca. Sacred vessels, funeral ornaments, the golden garden of the Coricancha, where life-sized replicas of corn, llamas, and human figures had been cast in solid gold as offerings to the sun god. All of it dismantled, packed, and shipped to fill a room for a pig farmer from Extremadura. The scale of the cultural destruction involved in that ransom before a single battle had been fought for Cusco is almost impossible to process. Centuries of accumulated sacred art melted down into ingots. The gold arrived over the course of 8 months, llama caravans coming down from the highlands, porters arriving from the coast, the room filling slowly, ingot by ingot, object by object. Spanish soldiers stood guard and watched, and even men who had grown up hearing stories about Inca wealth found themselves struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. One account describes a soldier walking through the accumulating treasure and simply being unable to speak. The total weight of gold eventually melted down came to roughly 6,000 kilograms. The silver filled the 2 adjoining rooms as promised. At the values of 1532, this was a sum that exceeded the annual revenue of the Spanish crown. It was the single largest wealth transfer in the history of European contact with the Americas, and it happened before the Spanish had conquered a single major Inca city. But here's the thing that Atahualpa did not understand, could not have understood because nothing in his experience had prepared him to understand it. He was operating inside an Inca framework of power, where a bargain made between rulers was a sacred contract enforced by the cosmic order itself. When a Sapa Inca gave his word, the universe held him to it. He assumed Pizarro operated inside a similar framework. He assumed that the delivery of the ransom would trigger the fulfillment of the promise. He had no concept, none, zero, of a world in which a man could take everything you offered and then simply decide the contract did not apply to him. That was not how power worked in Tawantinsuyu. It was, unfortunately for Atahualpa, exactly how power worked for a desperate Spanish conquistador thousands of miles from any authority that could hold him accountable. While the ransom was being assembled, Pizarro was receiving reinforcements. Diego de Almagro arrived with roughly 150 additional soldiers, nearly doubling the Spanish force in Peru. The political calculation was shifting. A living Atahualpa, free and back in command of his army, was a threat that grew more dangerous with every passing week. Atahualpa had already from captivity ordered the execution of his brother Huáscar, eliminating the one rival claimant who might have been useful to the Spanish as a puppet. He had also reportedly been in communication with his generals, Quizquiz and Chalcuchima, maintaining command of military forces that were still intact and still loyal. Pizarro's advisors began arguing that releasing him, regardless of what had been promised, was a strategic impossibility. Some of them believed it. Others just wanted a pretext to keep the gold and eliminate the one man with the authority to take it back. The trial of Atahualpa was one of the more grotesque pieces of legal theater in a conquest full of grotesque legal theater. He was charged with a list of crimes that included polygamy, idolatry, treason against the Spanish crown, a crown whose existence he had not known about 8 months earlier, and the murder of Huáscar, his own brother, who had been his prisoner and his enemy in a civil war. He was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by burning, a particularly horrifying fate within the Inca belief system, because a burned body could not be preserved as a royal mummy, and therefore could not exist in the afterlife. Atahualpa, facing this, agreed to be baptized. The baptism converted him, in the eyes of Spanish law, to Christianity, which meant he could be granted the mercy of a less terrible death. He was garroted, strangled with a cord, in the plaza of Cajamarca on the 26th of July, 1533. He had been a prisoner for 8 months. The ransom had been delivered in full. Not one coin of it was returned. There is a moment in the Spanish accounts that nobody talks about, but that I cannot stop thinking about. In the hours before his execution, Atahualpa was allowed to speak with his attendants. He gave instructions for the care of his children. He spoke with a composure, by all Spanish accounts, of a man who had accepted what was coming without losing his dignity inside it. One soldier wrote afterward that watching him walk to the garrote, Atahualpa moved the way he had always moved, as if the ground beneath his feet was a thing he was permitting to exist. Even stripped of his empire, even betrayed, even hours from death, he carried himself like a god. Whether that was genuine belief or the final, defiant performance of a man who refused to give his killers the satisfaction of seeing him break, we will never know. What we know is what it looked like from the outside. And from the outside, it looked like the most expensive dignity in history. The gold was melted, divided, and distributed among the soldiers according to rank. Pizarro's share alone made him one of the wealthiest men in the Spanish Empire. The soldiers who had been at Cajamarca received amounts that would have taken a laborer in Spain several lifetimes to accumulate. They had come to Peru with nothing. They left Cajamarca rich beyond anything their childhoods had made imaginable. And in Cusco, in the temples, in the administrative centers, in the households of the Inca nobility, word was spreading that the son of the sun was dead. The ransom had been paid, the promise had been broken, and whatever came next, it would not look anything like what had come before. The question now was not whether the empire would survive, it was how long it would take to finish dying. And the answer to that question was going to surprise everyone, including the Spanish. Here is what the history books usually do. They describe Cajamarca, they describe the ransom, they describe the execution of Atahualpa, and then they skip forward a few years and talk about colonial Peru, as if the transition were a formality, as if 12 million people simply looked at what had happened in that plaza and decided to accept it. That is not what happened. What happened was 40 years of war, resistance, betrayal, tactical brilliance, and slow, grinding attrition in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The Inca Empire did not fall at Cajamarca. It bled out over 4 decades in the cloud forests of a place called Vilcabamba. And the story of that resistance is one of the most remarkable last stands in the history of any civilization. After Atahualpa's execution, Pizarro made a calculated political decision that reveals exactly how well he understood the system he was trying to dismantle. He did not declare himself ruler of Peru. Instead, he installed an Inca puppet, a younger brother named Manco from Huáscar's lineage, who had every reason to despise Atahualpa's faction and who seemed initially like a manageable figurehead. The coronation was performed with full Inca ceremony in Cusco. Manco Inca was proclaimed Sapa Inca. The Spanish stood behind him and smiled. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of colonial cynicism, using the empire's own legitimacy structures to administer its own subjugation. For about 2 years, it worked, and then Manco Inca watched the Spanish closely enough to understand exactly what they were, and he made a decision that changed everything. In 1536, Manco Inca escaped from Spanish custody. Accounts differ on the details, some suggesting he was allowed to leave for a religious ceremony and simply did not come back, and within weeks he had assembled an army. The estimates of its size are staggering, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, drawn from Inca loyalists and allied peoples across the highlands. He laid siege to Cusco with a force that dwarfed anything the Spanish had faced since Cajamarca, and for 10 months the city was surrounded. The Spanish garrison inside Cusco, outnumbered by ratios that should have been unsurvivable, held on through a combination of defensive desperation, the military effectiveness of their indigenous allies, particularly the Huanca and Cañari peoples, who had their own reasons to fight against the Inca, and a series of tactical circumstances that, once again, defied any reasonable probability. Manco's forces set fire to the thatched rooftops of the city. A sudden hailstorm extinguished the fires. The Spanish called it a miracle. Manco called it a catastrophe, and eventually withdrew. But he did not surrender. He retreated into the jungle lowlands northwest of Cusco, to a region called Vilcabamba, and there he built something extraordinary, a shadow empire in exile. In the cloud forests and steep river valleys that the Spanish found nearly impossible to penetrate, Manco Inca established a functioning Inca state. He maintained the ceremonies, he preserved the administrative structures, he kept the quipu records, he trained soldiers in hybrid tactics that combined traditional Inca warfare with lessons learned from watching the Spanish fight. His forces began using captured horses, captured steel weapons, and a tactical flexibility that made them far more dangerous than the armies that had stood paralyzed outside Cajamarca. Vilcabamba was not a refugee camp. It was a government in waiting. Manco Inca ruled Vilcabamba for 9 years, conducting raids on Spanish settlements, disrupting supply lines, and making the colonial project in Peru considerably more expensive and dangerous than anyone in Madrid had anticipated. He was assassinated in 1544, not by the Spanish, but by a group of Spanish fugitives he had sheltered, who killed him during a game of horseshoes in a detail so bizarrely mundane it reads like something from a fever dream. His sons continued the resistance after him. 3 of them ruled Vilcabamba in succession over the following decades, each one inheriting a shrinking but defiant state, each one facing the slow, inexorable tightening of Spanish control over the highlands above them. The second of Manco's sons, Sayri Tupac, eventually negotiated with the Spanish and left Vilcabamba, accepting a pension and lands in exchange for recognizing colonial authority. He died 2 years later, under circumstances that were almost certainly not accidental. The third, Titu Cusi, was a far more complex figure, a man who had grown up in Vilcabamba, had been briefly held by the Spanish as a child, had escaped back to the jungle, and had emerged as a skilled political negotiator who understood both worlds well enough to play them against each other. He allowed Spanish missionaries into Vilcabamba while simultaneously maintaining Inca religious practices. He dictated a memoir, one of the only first-hand indigenous accounts of the conquest that survives, that is, by turns, heartbreaking and furious, and strategically calculated to appeal to the Spanish legal system's own stated principles against him. Titu Cusi died in 1571, probably of pneumonia, and the Spanish immediately suspected assassination by his own priests. They used the accusation as a pretext for the military campaign they had been planning for years. The last Sapa Inca was a man named Tupac Amaru, Manco's youngest son. He had grown up entirely within Vilcabamba, had never known any world but the jungle state his father had built, and had been elevated to the throne after Titu Cusi's death, partly because he was young and considered manageable by the factions around him. He was not a military commander in the mold of his father. He was a ceremonial figure, a keeper of the sacred flame in the most literal sense, the last living embodiment of the Inca divine lineage, ruling over a territory that by 1572 had shrunk to a fraction of what Tawantinsuyu had once been. When the Spanish viceroy, Francisco de Toledo, launched his final campaign into Vilcabamba with a substantial military force, the resistance collapsed within weeks. The jungle fortress fell. Tupac Amaru fled deeper into the lowlands. He was captured on a river in a canoe with a small group of followers, somewhere in the Amazon basin. He was brought to Cusco in chains. The trial, like Atahualpa's 40 years earlier, was a formality. Toledo had already decided the outcome. Tupac Amaru was convicted of crimes against the Spanish crown and sentenced to public beheading in the Plaza de Armas of Cusco, the same plaza where the ceremonies of the Inca Empire had once drawn thousands of worshippers to watch the son of the sun drink chicha from golden cups in honor of his father, the sun. The execution was scheduled for a morning in September of 1572. The accounts say that tens of thousands of indigenous people came to watch, filling the plaza and the streets around it in silence. Tupac Amaru was led out in front of them, the last in a lineage of rulers that stretched back to the mythical founder Manco Capac, the first son of the sun, who was said to have emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca at the beginning of time. He spoke to the crowd. He told them that the religion his ancestors had taught them was false. Or, at least, that is what the Spanish accounts say he told them, in a conversion speech that most historians read as coerced rather than sincere. Then the executioner's sword came down, and the 300-year dynasty of the Sons of the Sun ended in a plaza that had once been the center of the world. But here is what Toledo did not account for, and what history does not let him forget. The execution of Tupac Amaru did not extinguish the resistance. It ignited it. The memory of the last Sapa Inca became the symbolic fuel for indigenous rebellions that burned across the Andes for the next 2 centuries. The name Tupac Amaru became a rallying cry, an identity, a promise that what had been taken could be reclaimed. 200 years after the beheading in Cusco, a man named José Gabriel Condorcanqui took the name Tupac Amaru Quinto and led the largest indigenous uprising in the history of colonial America, an insurrection that came terrifyingly close to ending Spanish rule in the Andes entirely. The empire was gone. The resistance, it turned out, was a different matter. There is a terrace on the slopes above the Sacred Valley in Peru that has been producing crops continuously for more than 500 years. The same terrace, the same engineering, the same underground channels carrying water to the same roots in the same soil. The Inca who designed it are gone. The empire that built it is gone. The civilization that understood in precise agricultural detail why that specific angle of slope at that specific altitude would capture exactly the right amount of sunlight for exactly the right duration. That civilization was dismantled, looted, and buried under a colonial system that spent 3 centuries telling the people who lived there that everything their ancestors had built was primitive and wrong. And yet the terrace still works. That is the first thing you need to hold in your head when you think about what the Inca left behind. The physical infrastructure outlasted the empire that built it because some ideas are so well engineered that even the people trying to erase them cannot make them stop functioning. Quechua is spoken today by somewhere between 8 and 10 million people across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and the surrounding regions. It was the administrative language of Tawantinsuyu, the tongue that the empire used to bind dozens of distinct cultures under a single communicative framework. The Spanish tried, with varying degrees of systematic effort, to suppress it. They replaced Inca temples with Catholic churches, sometimes literally building the new structures on top of the old foundations, using the same precisely cut Inca stones as the base for colonial architecture. In Cusco, you can walk up to a colonial-era building and see exactly where the Inca stonework ends and the Spanish construction begins. The join is unmistakable because the Inca stonework is better. The stones fit together so precisely that no mortar was needed, and 5 centuries of earthquakes that have cracked and crumbled the Spanish additions have left the Inca foundations essentially untouched. The conquerors built on top of what they could not destroy. And what they could not destroy held everything up. But I want to be honest with you about something, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves a clean ending. The question of whether the fall of the Inca Empire was inevitable is one that serious historians have argued about for decades, and the answer is genuinely uncomfortable. Because on one hand, you can construct a compelling case that the specific collision of factors at Cajamarca, the civil war, the disease, the timing, the personality of Atahualpa, the audacity of Pizarro, was a chain of accidents so particular that a dozen small changes anywhere along the line would have produced a completely different outcome. Move the smallpox epidemic by 20 years, and Huayna Capac dies with a clear succession plan in place, and the empire that Pizarro encounters is unified and unbroken. Give Atahualpa a single advisor who had seen European cavalry before. Give him one reason, any reason, to take those 168 men seriously. The whole thing unravels differently. But on the other hand, and this is the part that keeps me up at night, the structural vulnerabilities were real. The succession crisis was not an accident. It was a flaw baked into the system's foundational logic, waiting for the right moment to activate. The resentments of conquered peoples were not accidents. They were the predictable result of an expansion model that absorbed nations by force and held them by threat. The Inca Empire, for all its genuine brilliance, was also a system of extraction and compulsion that generated enemies at roughly the same rate it generated roads. When the moment of crisis came, those enemies did not come to the empire's defense. They came to its burial. And that is not a detail you can attribute to Spanish cunning alone. That is a consequence of choices the Inca made long before Pizarro was born. So what do we do with all of that? What do we do with an empire that was simultaneously one of the most sophisticated administrative achievements in human history and a system that required the subjugation of millions of people to function? The comfortable answer is to say it was complicated, that all empires are contradictions, that we should not judge the past by the standards of the present. That answer is not wrong, exactly, but I think it is a little too easy. Because the people who were conquered by the Inca had an opinion about it, and the people who were conquered by the Spanish had an opinion about it. And the descendants of both groups of conquered people are still living with the consequences of both conquests right now, today, in the same Andean valleys where the terraces still grow potatoes at altitudes that European agriculture still cannot reliably match. Here is the thing about Tawantinsuyu that I think gets lost in the drama of Cajamarca and the gold and the executions and the resistance. At its best, and it was capable of genuine best, it was a system that took the problem of human survival in one of the most geographically hostile environments on Earth and solved it with a creativity and thoroughness that has rarely been matched anywhere in history. The Andes are not a forgiving place. The altitude is brutal. The climate swings from tropical to Arctic within a day's walk. The earthquakes are constant. The droughts are punishing. And the Inca looked at all of that and built a civilization that could feed 12 million people reliably, that could mobilize labor across a continent without currency or markets, that could integrate dozens of distinct cultures without erasing their languages or their local deities, and that could do all of this while simultaneously producing art, architecture, and astronomical knowledge of a quality that still astonishes the people who study it. That was real. That happened. And it was gone within 2 generations of first contact with Europe. If you want a lesson that travels, a thread that runs from 1532 directly into the present, here it is. The Inca Empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was blindsided by a convergence of factors that its entire cosmological framework had made it structurally unable to anticipate. A civilization that has never faced an existential external threat does not build the cognitive tools to recognize one when it arrives. A system so complete, so self-sufficient, so certain of its own centrality to the order of the universe that it literally had no word for the end of itself. And that is not a failure unique to the Inca. That is a human failure. The failure of total certainty. The failure of a world so well constructed that it stopped being able to imagine anything outside itself. Every powerful system in history that has ever collapsed has collapsed partly because of this, the inability to take seriously the thing that does not fit the existing model of how the world works. The Inca looked at 168 starving strangers on horses and saw curiosities. Rome looked at the barbarian migrations and saw a border problem. Every collapsed certainty in history looked, at the moment before its fall, like the permanent condition of the world. And then the thing it could not imagine walked into the plaza. The sons of the sun are gone. The golden disk in the Coricancho was melted down 5 centuries ago, and its metal is dispersed somewhere in the accumulated wealth of a world that has been spent and respent so many times that no atom of it can be traced back to the temple it came from. Atahualpa's body was never found. The Spanish accounts say he was buried in Cajamarca, but indigenous traditions insist his remains were taken by loyal followers to a place the Spanish never located. Maybe that is myth. Maybe it is not. Tupac Amaru's head was mounted on a pike in Cusco's plaza after his execution, and the Spanish reported that within days more indigenous people were coming to look at it than had ever come to any church service they had organized. They took the head down, they buried it, and the veneration continued anyway, in secret, in the places where colonial authorities could not see. You can bury the head. You cannot bury what it meant. The sun goes down every evening over the Andes, and every morning, without asking anyone's permission, it comes back up.